This is IBM Museum. So on this video, once again, I've got behind me the benched out Model 80 Type 3. And that's normally with a 386DX 25 megahertz CPU. In this instance, I have an upgrade that was designed by Kingston Technologies for IBM. Uses the IBM CPU called the 46 DLC2. And as we went through the routines with the System Information Tool on UNPC, mainly in an aspect of there's that interrupt function call of interrupt 15 hex function C9 hex that reports that CPU reset signature that's stored away in contents on the computer when it boots up. And when we were running it against the CPU, it just was not reporting it correctly. It was identifying as an IBM type CPU. A lot of the megahertz was identified correctly for the UNPC utility program, but we weren't getting the expected information. When we looked where those contents in that extended CMOS, where it should be holding that CPU reset signature, it was just zeros that were in there. And some months ago, I actually did have one of the systems benched out, a Type 3 planar, and I had a conventional CPU in there of the 386DX 25 megahertz. Okay. And I was sure that it gave me that information, reported it correctly. And I've gone through, as a preliminary step on this video, I went through and put the stock CPU back in, ran through the routines, and yeah, it was reported correctly. So it's just something about this CPU daughter card or something that is not being done on it compared to the stock CPU. So here's the page of on that CPU daughter card. Let's see if we can get to the point where we can interact with it. So I can scroll through. Now you notice that there's some utilities there at the top, that BLC underscore util.exe, and it talks about being a utility diskette, self-extracting diskette maker, and then below it has that lightning underscore 486 BLC or BL66, and that's supposed to be the 46. The BL stands for Blue Lightning, and that's what that DLC2 chip was referred to a lot of time, or this package of that CPU daughter card that I have in there. And it talks about the Model 70 and Model 80 utility diskette. There's even a page that describes this, and the PDF file that goes through and explains what that CPU upgrade does, adds the performance onto the system. And I was thinking that was part of it, where we weren't running through those utility programs, or there's typically, like on the Kingston 386, or what they call the 386 now with the exclamation point, that upgrade from Kingston Technologies. I've featured those in the past. Those plug into a 286 socket, like on the Model 50, the 50Z, or the Model 60. Also for the ISA models of the 25 286 and 30 286, they have versions for all of those. And then there's a version that goes even into the old IBM PC AT model that came out in like 1984. And so those have features. And of course, the 386 SX chip is a little bit of a step above the 286 CPU. So it has some drivers to go through and to effectively optimize that CPU package, enable or disable the cache, and whether even those drivers are loaded or not. If you don't have the drivers loaded, the system even treats it worse than it performs worse than if you had the 286 CPU in there. So I thought that was maybe part of it. I've seen the drivers installed that go through and they set up and they give the feedback of that it detected the CPU and is that it's running a certain level. And I just got disappointed in every step that I did going through and checking this out. Now, one of the interesting things is it talks about, it has that note there. It says you must use the 8570/80 reference diskette version 1.10 or later. And I do have, in fact, I'll go through and I'll run the reference diskette. We can get the system powered on and get that aspect going. And I've got in the let me go through and hide the browser capture for now. We can even get over to the so I've going through, and one of the things I did have to do on this system was to go through and remove the hard drive cage and stuff like that, just to get at where that CPU is on the planer. And since I didn't have a hard drive in there, it was easy enough to do. I actually have this Kingston data card that has a hard drive on there. I'm not spending memory in any way, but it's a nice little portable, in a sense, hard drive. And it effectively has, an ADF, and there's aspects to it that it presents on the screen. It actually has a BIOS, and that's that long beep that you heard as the system booted up. It is interesting. It almost sounds like an error, that the system is doing an error, that it gives that short beep and then a long beep. And that's just a normal process for the for that Kingston data card. So here we see from this that the reference diskette is version 1.12. I mean, I was sure that I've grabbed the latest reference diskette. We're actually going to go through, I could even go through, and the same thing for the revision levels. It shows the version of the reference diskette. And I'm going to go through, I'll eject the diskette from the drive. We'll go through, press enter, just to show you what comes up on the screen for that BIOS extension that runs that Kingston data card. And so, and I'll go back and bring up the page a later point once we boot up, and just to show some of the contents and the things I had to do for the links that are there on that page. Okay, and there is a kind of significant pause here, and this is from the Kingston data card, and it's even interesting. It goes through and it does that initial beep, and then it even churns the diskette drive a little bit too as it goes through, and so you saw that initial information that came up. Now, let's go back to getting, okay. So at the top of this, and again, we've got those utility diskettes. What I've learned is that BLC_util.exe, that's a self-extracting diskette. I have my 32-bit tweener system. I mean, that's not an image file format. That's a self-extracting diskette, standard IBM variety. And so I have my tweener system, but I learned that that's a 720 KB image. You have to have a double density diskette, not a high density. And that was fine. There's even probably, when I was looking at this video before, I was thinking, hey, it's a good place to show where going through and retrieving the files from where they are online that I've got the same page up that I could go through and retrieve those files. Now Windows XP no longer supports making a 720 KB diskette. It even from the command line, you can only do a 1.44 megabyte diskette. That's the only formatting that it recognizes, the only ability to go through. Now, if you have a correct, diskette, a double density diskette, I don't see where that self-extracting program would fail or anything like that. But I normally go through and I like to have even my diskettes. I like to go through and format them on the machine that they're going on, in particular, just to make sure that that drive can also read the diskette once I get the files over to it. Or I may be going through and clearing some older diskettes in this case. So I had to go through and find, and I've got enough of them. I got that kind of that tan stack of diskettes that I've got back there. That's all double density diskettes. But just going through and getting them located, and that's where that nice thing of the dual boot system came in, the dual boot to MS-DOS. So I could go through, I could boot to MS-DOS once I had all those files to be extracted over in the that ref disk directory that's accessible for my C drive. That's the partition I have my DOS on. And MS-DOS, of course, will go through, if you give it the correct parameters, it will format a double density diskette, a 720 KB diskette, perfectly fine. And so I went through and I first did that BLC underscore util diskette. Here it is, that tan diskette that I have, and I need to get to where I have a label on it, get the reference diskette out of there. And we can go back over to the input of the PC. So once I extracted that, and we can get over to the, we'll just get over to the A diskette, do a directory listing. I mean, I was expecting an installation utility, the drivers that go through and do this. And this is the contents of, after extracting that diskette. It's got this fast and slow BAT, fast command and slow command, this dfast.exe, dslow.exe, ofast.exe, oslow.exe. And so let me kind of explain the file structure here. If you do like a type that fast.bat, all that runs is that dfast.exe utility. So what the kind of the encoding is here, of course, the batch files are for the DOS side, and those command files are actually for the OS2 side. And the dfast and dslow is for DOS, the DOS fast or DOS slow. And then the ofast or oslow, that's for OS2, fast or slow. And I'm sure those command files do the same thing. They just execute ofast.exe or oslow.exe. And so let's even run that dfast. I mean, we could run from the batch file the same way. And that's all it does. There's no reporting. There's no, hey, the CPU is identified this way, or the CPU is sped up to this level, or it doesn't, the program doesn't even say what it does. And that's the DOS side. I don't know what it does on the OS2 side. And so that's the only programs that were here on this diskette. And it, like I say, it took me going through getting a 720 KB diskette ready. I had those around, luckily, but if I didn't, because you can't extract that 720 KB diskette to 1.44 if you need the correct diskette to match the image. So that was kind of a delay that I had to do. And so I looked at, well, if the IBM, because that blc underscore util.exe, that's the IBM side. And then below that, it's got that longer executable name, that lightning underscore for, and at least that is it says utility diskette. So I downloaded and ran that, and I ran it from the command line, of course. And I ran it from the command line under XP that I could deal with the long file names. I mean, if it had shown up under DOS, I could have still ran it by what it showed in the DOS directory. And it didn't create a diskette. All it did was go through and extract the very same files as that other one. And so I just don't know. I've gone through, there is the installation guide down below. It talks about the Lightning 46 installation guide. And then it has that Kingston link over to the other side. And that's, Kingston is the old archive location where that file is. And actually both of those point to the same PDF. At least the local copy of that is good on Major Tom's site. You can look through it. I doubt if I'll go through and pull it up, but there is mainly the thing to the installation guide is that it talks about just the physical layout of the Type 1, Type 2, and Type 3 Model 80 systems, and then the Type 1, Type 2, and Type 3 of the Model 70 platforms. Just how that, where the CPU is located and going through, it's strictly a physical location. And when it gets down to, it even talks about once you got the CPU in there, close the cover, and it's a wrap. It doesn't go through and talk necessarily about anything else of the program or a driver or utility diskette installation to go through that would maybe enable or disable the cache functions and have some functionality there that it could work with the board or report the board a little bit better, or have the CPU in some way better identified. And so I don't even know why there's that note there about that you need the reference diskette of a particular version. I've ran that reference diskette of that version, and it doesn't go through and really recognize anything else, at least on the Type 3 Model 80. And I went through all the text on this page. It does kind of condense some of the manual contents. It gives a layout excellent of the board, tells the switch settings. And I was sure that I confirm that I have the default switch settings and everything else. That doesn't give me that reported CPU reset signature with where I was, running the system information tool or the UNPC program. Just it doesn't do it. And see, there's all the diagrams. That's just straight from the manuals, talking about the Model 70 and Model 80 of how they're positioned, and they even have a little interposer or extender in some cases to get that daughter card in a little bit higher level. For the Type 3 Model 80, I didn't need that. And I don't believe I need it on the Model 70. I also have a Model 70 AXX, and that's really interesting because it has the CPU daughter card as it is anyway, that 25 megahertz 386DX in this instance, because there's also the CPU daughter card of the 46DX 25 megahertz. And I featured those in prior videos. But I thought that might be a good portion of this video as well. I'll go through and I'll get the Type 3 Model 80 down, and we'll put up the Type 3 Model 70. Swap out the CPUs just to see. I was even thinking to the point that if I had get the right view up here, if there were actually drivers that had to be installed on the hard drive that ran from the on the system to basically enable features of that CPU daughter card or identify it correctly, then I'd have that on that Kingston data card hard drive. So that's a relatively portable thing. It's on a 32-bit microchannel slot that I could go through on the Model 70. I could, have an adapter slot available for it. I could go through and actually disconnect that DBA ESDI drive and still have a hard drive on the system that I had those utilities and everything else could identify. And I'll still run through on the Model 70, but I know that there's just not any drivers. And the only real thing that we'd see there is if there's any sort of difference BIOS routine that is maybe supported somehow or handles that differently. And my only thought on the Model 70 was that since it has that CPU daughter card already between the 386DX and the 46DX, the BIOS actually changes with that as well. You have to change the BIOS chips depending on which CPU daughter card you have on there. But I thought IBM may have set that up a little bit differently to recognize like the 46 level of CPU. And I even wonder for that BIOS of that is paired with that 46DX of CPU daughter card of maybe possibly running that on the 386DX daughter card with this module plugged in or something like that. I don't think I'm going to get that involved for this video, but we're going to go through and I'll at least put this 46 Blue Lightning CPU daughter card in the Model 70 and kind of see if that gives us any further CPU information of that CPU reset signature that should identify this. And otherwise, for me, writing utilities like the system information tool, I'll just have to account for it. I mean, I'll have to go through, and when that nullified value is returned, to have some routine that detects it correctly. And it's interesting because the UNPC utility actually goes through and identifies as an IBM CPU. There's other ways to do that other than the reset signature, but I've got to go through and see how the UNPC book that I've got back here actually goes through that routine and determines that. And but we're missing something. I think there's got to be some other software that's associated with this other than just these fast and slow programs that goes through and these cache chips and the controllers for them, that logic on the CPU daughter card, that cache can be controlled. And that's one of the primary things that fast and slow may do, is just working with that cache for going through and slowing down or speeding up it's going to be of going through and turning that cache off to effectively slow down the performance of the system. But those things don't even report. Those programs don't report what they're doing on the CPU daughter card at all. And so it was just really disappointing. I just wonder, I'll have to dig around a little bit more and see if there's just some other utilities out there that handle this aspect, because it just really confuses me having the basis of the old Kingston upgrade of the 386 now. Those boards for the 286 based PS2s, an upgrade that you could put in there, really up the performance of that. So at this point, I think we'll go through and probably power off the Model 80 here. I can pause the video and get this CPU in the Model 70 just to see what results that gives. So I will be right back on video. Okay, so here I am back with the Model 70, and I learned that little interposer, the little extensions, CPU extension. In this case, it's required. Probably the installation manual talks about it for this. I mean, we have a goodly stack of things here. We've got the planar at the very bottom. We've got that CPU daughter card as it is anyway that adapts has a 386DX, has that cache controller and a 387DX floating point unit if you have one to populate that socket. And so I learned that little extension is required if you have a 387DX in the socket. Thankfully, this clears the 80385 cache controller chip in there because I don't have that little interposer. So I just pulled the FPU chip. Really, the test that we need to do, I'm focusing on the CPU, not the floating point unit. And I've got the reference diskette. I went through and actually pulled a lot of the other stuff. I pulled the memory card that adds 8 more megabyte. That SIM was loose. And the other adapters, just because I know on my reference diskette, and that was why I was running on the Type 3 Model 80, and that same reference diskette works for the Model 70s, and so the desktop and tower versions of each other. And so I know I have the Kingston data card. I've got the file moved over to this reference diskette that I have in there, and I just pulled all the other adapters. I went through, and in the very back, I pulled the DBA ESDI drive. So I'm just running off of that Kingston drive. And of course, since I had to raise the drive platform anyway to get that daughter card, all that stack situated, I mean, it went through and it pulled the battery anyway. So I have to rerun through that configuration. Let's do that at this point. And I just want to see what the results are. The nice thing on that data card is I know I have all the utilities on there. the system information tool, that UNPC directory, and that's what I intended it for, was an adapter that I could go through and move around between 32-bit systems for that, as long as I had the ADF on the reference diskette of the system. And so we're reference diskette, and I need to let me get my microphone clipped on. I don't know if, I think the audio is still probably pretty good. I'll go through and check it. So we've got that same reference disk of 1.12. Just it's asking to automatically configure the system. I'll leave the reference diskette in there because it's probably going to nag me about the time and date, even though that's not real critical. Setting it to the actual current date, it's going to complain with that default BIOS state that it has. Okay. So say we'll leave the, and I guess I could have gone through and shown the, and now we'll get that big long beep with this system too once that Kingston data card is set up in the, with its BIOS extension. Okay, and it's going to boot to the reference diskette. We'll just briefly go in there and do the time and date in the set features. Okay, and I guess the battery really didn't effectively drain for the system. I mean, it's still, I think we went through daylight savings time or something else for the time being an hour off. But we will eject the reference diskette. We should be able to boot from that Kingston data card and just briefly run through the utilities that we have on it to see if it is in any way reporting the that CPU reset signature. I mean, whether that's saved away with that data card. And like I say, that long beep, it's disconcerting because you think that the computer's encountering an error when it beeps that long. Okay. So what we'll do here first is to go to, let's just go into the UNPC program. Go down to the system information and that CPU information. And see again, we're getting it's identified as a 46 by IBM, and the determination of the 46. I mean, that's just it running. The routine runs and figures out that it supports that the 380 or the 46 instruction set. In this case, the 46SX without FPU. And if I had that little height extender socket, and had the FPU in there, it'd probably report it as a 46DX. It'd be that confused. But again, we get the CPU version detection not supported in this BIOS or CPU. And if we go down to our extended get to our extended CMOS. And get down to that 190 and 191. And those are zeroed out again. There's no information in there. And so it's the CPU daughter card that goes through and does that. And years ago, that must have, I had this Blue Lightning module, and it wasn't always on my Model 80 Type 3. I had it in some other system, and I was going through and checking that CPU reset signature, and I think it caused me some confusion back years ago and I reported that the model didn't even support that CPU reset signature storing that. And then later when I benched with the stock processors, I saw that it worked for all those, the PS2 models that were 386 SX or above. Now, I do want to preface this as well with the fact that that CPU reset signature it's just not all of that of a necessarily a critical thing that in a lot of the clone side, the non-IBM side, the software developers, when they wrote the software for those 386 SX, 386DX, and early 46, before the CPU ID instruction came out, it just really wasn't much of a concern to them. They had other routines that could determine the level of the CPU, but oftentimes they didn't depend on that CPU reset signature at all. It just didn't come into the mix. It wasn't a critical thing. If you wanted to determine the CPU family level, that was easy enough to do by the instruction set that the CPU reported. So this is just what I'm trying to say is that it's not the end of the world or anything else like that, but it's just a side effect that CPU daughter card for some reason is doing that. And I mean, I could go through and I could even do a utility, and I think that there's still something more out there, an installation utility, as I referenced earlier. But I could go through and I could write a simple utility that just goes through and plugs those values into the appropriate extended CMOS or whatever. So, you know, that the function call would be supported in that case. And maybe the utility does something to that effect, or, you know, but I'll know enough on my testing routine when I develop the replacement to the system information tool that I'm doing for DOS and for Windows. I'll know how to account for this CPU. I may get into some later videos. We may even do some out and out replacements of the just some checks of the Cyrix CPUs and Texas Instrument CPUs that are pin compatible with the 386DX. In some cases, they're a 46 class CPU that's on that. Even if they're not clock doubled, they go through, and they do give a different reset signature, and I think that those will be reported correctly. But it is kind of interesting for me to see, you know, something from IBM that just, I don't know, there's something that I think I'm missing on this upgrade for the way that the thing was designed, and what, you know, it should report a lot more in those utilities, those supporting utility programs that slow and, you know, speed up and slow down the CPU. And it was just crazy for that, for the, you know, these utilities at the top being the same thing, and just being all that, just being those little basic things, one being a 720 KB diskette image, and the other one being a high density 1.44 megabyte and it extracted the files on the hard drive for me. Just wherever you ran the program from DOS. It wasn't a utility that prompted you to insert a diskette or anything else. You could copy them over to whatever diskette or another method that you had to get them on the machine. So I don't know why that little note about the reference diskette and things like that. This 486 DLC2 upgrade, or sometimes it's referred to as the Blue Lightning upgrade. I just don't know that all the details aren't there. I would have thought even for the installation manual, it would have covered a lot more of those utilities, what they did, and maybe be a little bit more verbose in how they're run or whatever else. But you live and learn. So despite me spending the time just going round and round and having to address some of the areas, in the end, it's just I'm not getting any further information, but it allows me to understand the parameters of how that CPU daughter card upgrade works on the Model 70 and Model 80 system. And it might even be, I would expect probably the same level if you put on a Type 1 or Type 2 planar of the Model 70 or Model 80. I would expect probably the same behavior, where it would go through and not have that CPU reset signature recorded by the system in the appropriate place. So we're going to move past that. I'm going to go through and I'm going to pause the video just to show what I have for that interrupt 15 hex C9 hex routine. I do even want to I can I think I've got that just in the, I wonder if I copied that over to the hard drive though. Major Tom did a little utility program that just basically goes through this, that bottom file, because this is organized by date, it looks like. And of course, without that program reporting it correctly, 9, if I could type, and that just goes through and see, it's interesting from there of how it just runs a routine and reports whatever. But that's interesting for that function not supported. And the carry flag of 1 for failure. Because this is just a blind. Does it? I may have to talk with Major Tom a little bit more and find out, because this actually sounds like that BIOS call is not running correctly in this instance, or it goes through. And there is one on the switch saying that it goes through and flushes the cache, but it is identifying there as that it's for the 15 decimal in the documentation, not the 15 hex. And I wonder if that, and that's flushing that the cache that's on board there before an interrupt call of that sort. So maybe that's what's going through and maybe affecting that too. Let me go through and I'll pause the video just to get the that page, that browser page I can show. Okay, and I have to use that local file copy again, just to get something that's that older copy that is somehow cached and read by the OBS software I'm using for recording, doesn't get the right this latest updated file I've had online for a long period. I wonder if there's some process of how I need to refresh that on my site or something else. But this is the interrupt 15 hex function C9 hex, and that's one of the return registers is that carry flag is set on error and that 86 hex is function not supported. So, and I wonder, I don't think that there's any validation checking for the response of the call. It's just reporting that it's not supported. But that'll be something that I'll just have to dig out a little bit more. I'm glad it gave me that result. I wonder if it'd probably give me the same result on the Model 80 Type 3. This is going to take a little bit more study, just so I'm looking to get free of it and moving on. And some of these Model 80 oddities that I've been seeing crop up with the System Information Tool on the UNPC program. But I'll give links to that 46 DLC2 page and this page in the video description, so people can look those over. And this is the update that I've done to how these models are saving away that CPU reset signature in the case where they have that stock CPU or a recognized CPU that they put in there. So, you know, this is just that odd content again, this warts and all. But I'll be moving on. We'll look over some other systems here soon on the next few videos and look at other aspects as we get moving on. At some point, I'm going to show where I'm at with the System Information Tool replacement, the programs I'm doing for Windows and for DOS, to show where they are and how I have to account for factors like this, that the system or CPU throws a loop, you know, at me to, or some undefined value that I've got to, you know, go through and figure out. So if you enjoy this off-the-wall content, you know, click on that like button. And if you have not done so already, please subscribe to my channel. That is all I have for now. This is IBM Museum. Thank you.